Many trafficking victims are never identified or assisted and may not come into contact with practitioners who can help them. Trafficking victims require clear and comprehensive information about their status as trafficking victims and the services that exist to support them. They need this information both in places where they have been exploited as well as once they have returned home. A directory of services for trafficking victims puts critical information directly in the hands of trafficking victims so that they can seek out the assistance needed to support their recovery and reintegration. This video explains what a directory of services for trafficking victims is and provides step-by-step guidance on how to develop and implement a directory in a local or national context. This video is to be used alongside the tool for practitioners on developing a directory of services for trafficking victims. A directory of services educates and informs trafficking victims about what constitutes trafficking in persons and the rights and entitlements of trafficking victims. A directory of services provides information about the types of assistance and support available to trafficking victims in a specific area or country, and how to access available assistance and support. When trafficking victims have this information, they can make informed decisions about the assistance they may want and need at different stages of their lives after trafficking and in response to different life situations that they may face. Some trafficking victims may choose not to be formally identified, but still wish to receive assistance and support. The Directory of Services provides information about services for identified trafficking victims, as well as services that vulnerable individuals can access, even if they have not been or do not wish to be formally identified as a trafficking victim. The target audience of this type of Directory of Services is adult trafficking victims and their families. For child trafficking victims, a directory of services will require modification to ensure children and their families can understand the information presented. This type of directory of services can also be used by practitioners to strengthen their knowledge of trafficking in persons and enable them to provide relevant, useful, and up-to-date information to trafficking victims about the services available to them. A directory of services may be developed by one organization or institution, or by several organizations or institutions working together. There are 4 main steps in the development of a directory of services for trafficking victims. Within each step, there are further sub-steps to be implemented. Step 1. Design your implementation plan. At this step, you should choose your target audience, determine the geographic scope, choose the language or languages to be used, decide on a format, choose an implementing partner institution or organization if appropriate and relevant, anticipate and address any ethical or legal considerations, and plan for sustainability. Choose your target audience. The first sub-step in designing your implementation plan is to choose your target audience. Consider if your directory of services will be for adult and/or child trafficking victims, victims of a specific gender, victims of a specific form of trafficking, or all trafficking victims. Remember that if your target audience is child trafficking victims, a directory of services will require tailoring the information to children's age, literacy, and stages of maturity. A broad target audience allows you to reach, inform, and facilitate assistance to more trafficking victims. However, a broader target audience will impact the format and content of the directory of services. It will also have time and resource implications. Determine the geographic scope. After choosing your target audience, determine the geographic scope. The directory of services may be nationwide or focused on a specific area within a country. Determine what scope aligns with your geographic location, your mandate, and how and where to best reach trafficking victims. The geographic scope of a directory of services needs to include services in areas where victims live. Yet, some communities may not have many or any services available for trafficking victims, or even services generally. This requires including information about the closest available services, how to contact these service providers, and transportation options to reach these services. Some trafficking victims may seek assistance while in another country. The geographic scope of the directory of services may need to include services in relevant destination countries for your target audience. Choose the language or languages to be used. Next, you need to consider what languages your target audience speaks. This will determine which languages the directory of services should be translated to. For example, a directory of services developed in a destination country should be available in the languages spoken by foreign trafficking victims. In a country or community where multiple languages are spoken, the directory of services should be made available in as many local languages as possible. When you have insufficient resources to translate the full directory of services, consider options for shorter length material that can be translated. Consider also whether some content can be conveyed visually so as to limit the need for full translation. Decide on a format. During Step 1, you will need to decide on a format for the directory of services. Determine if the directory of services will be published in hard copy, as an electronic version, or in both formats, as this has implications for the development process. The format of the directory of services should be based on an assessment of the needs and preferences of your target audience, including the reasons why a hard copy or electronic version would be most suitable for your target audience. The format must also be aligned with your organization or institution's available resources and technical capacities. Ensure that you have the needed resources to update and maintain the directory of services in the chosen format. Choose an implementing partner institution or organization, if appropriate and relevant. You may choose to work with another institution on the development and implementation of the directory of services. The precise nature of their involvement will vary, but may include co-creation, technical support, and/or resources. Once agreements are reached with any partner agencies, you might want to sign a memorandum of understanding to formalize this relationship and ensure each partner commits to specific roles and responsibilities, timelines, and resources. Anticipate and address any ethical or legal considerations. It is important to identify possible ethical or legal issues that might arise in the design or implementation of the directory of services and develop a strategy to mitigate or address these. Brainstorm any potential for harm in the use of the directory of services. This might include what to do if service providers do not answer the phone when a victim calls, or if service providers do not provide services as agreed in the directory of services, or if service providers are insensitive or discriminatory. Work with your colleagues and partner agencies to determine solutions and strategies should harm occur. Plan for sustainability. A directory of services is not a one-off publication. It should be regularly updated, improved, and distributed over time. It may also be expanded to cover more areas or different target audiences as needed. Consider what steps and partnerships are needed in your country or area to ensure the continuity and sustainability of the directory of services in the long term. Step 2. Develop content and map services. At this step, you should determine information that trafficking victims need, map existing services, set criteria for inclusion in the directory of services, validate information, and establish feedback and accountability mechanisms. Determine information that trafficking victims need to understand their experiences and situations. A directory of services is more than just a list of services and service providers. It should include information that trafficking victims need to understand and name their trafficking experiences, including what rights they have and opportunities to recover and move on from trafficking exploitation. Key topics in a directory of services might include understanding trafficking in persons, victims' rights and entitlements, a description of the assistance and services available, guidance on how to access services. Determining the topics that a directory of services should include requires researching and documenting what information trafficking victims in your country or area want and need. This should ideally involve speaking with trafficking victims and practitioners to learn directly from them about their information needs. Map existing services that can be accessed by trafficking victims. At Step 2, you will map existing services within the geographic scope determined at Step 1. This involves conducting desk-based, telephone, internet, and in-person information gathering to compile a list of service providers to potentially include. In mapping services, look beyond assistance available specifically for victims of trafficking. Mapping should capture all of the types of services that victims may want and need after exiting trafficking. Services might include meeting basic needs such as food or clothing, housing, accommodation, or care options, medical assistance, psychological support and counseling, education, training, and life skills, economic empowerment opportunities, administrative assistance and support such as registration and accessing documents, legal assistance and support including during legal proceedings, safety and security measures, case management including monitoring and supporting the victim over time, family mediation and counseling, assistance to victims' family members, and return assistance to a home country or community. Set criteria for inclusion in the directory of services. During the mapping process, you should assess any eligibility criteria or requirements that must be met to receive services. For example, eligibility for services might be based on certain characteristics like age or gender or area of residence. Some service providers have requirements that must be met to receive services, like having identity documents or being formally identified as a trafficking victim. This information must be clearly conveyed in the directory of services so that trafficking victims know which services they are eligible for and what requirements they might have to meet. To facilitate mapping of service providers, the information that is gathered can be entered into a Microsoft Excel template or other spreadsheet software or database system. A sample version of a Microsoft Excel template accompanies this video for you to adapt to your purposes. Service providers should be required to commit to meeting certain standards and obligations to be included in the directory of services. After initial mapping, determine the criteria for which service-providing institutions or organizations are to be included. For example, inclusion criteria might be licensed or accredited agencies, professionally licensed practitioners, agencies with victim-centered and trauma-informed policies. Validate services and service providers to be included. It is necessary to validate the information in the directory of services. You will need to contact each of the service providers included to confirm they are aware of and agree to their inclusion, and that they commit to meeting the standards and obligations of inclusion. During the validation process, you should also determine what victims need to know before they contact a particular service provider. In the directory of services, clearly explain how victims can best communicate their needs to the service provider. Establish feedback and accountability mechanisms. The directory of services should include information on what to do if trafficking victims are not treated or assisted properly. For example, if they do not receive requested services or are poorly treated by service providers. Establish feedback and accountability mechanisms in the directory of services so that victims who are not treated or assisted properly can report this and be able to access the services that they need. Step 3. Design and test the directory of services. At this step, you should design the directory of services, conduct an external review process, translate the directory of services, and pilot the directory of services. Design the directory of services. The directory of services should be accessible, user-friendly, and appropriate for its intended audience. Step 3 is the step at which you decide how information will be presented in the directory of services. This decision will be directly informed by the format, electronic or hard copy, and target audience. Remember that if your target audience includes child trafficking victims, this will require tailoring to children of different ages and stages of development and designing the directory of services in a child-friendly manner. In thinking about design, you can reflect on some key questions. How can you make information about services easy to understand? How can you present information in a simple, comprehensible way across your target audience? What visuals and graphics are needed to effectively convey information? Conduct an external review process. Once drafted and designed, it is important that the directory of services is reviewed and validated by key institutions, organizations, and technical experts to ensure accuracy of the content as well as the way in which information is presented. Translate the directory of services into relevant languages. In many cases, the directory of services will need to be translated into one or more languages to reach the target audience. Translation needs to occur after the internal and external review process, but before piloting so that it can be tested in the language of the target audience. Working with local translators will help to ensure that translation is accurate and context-specific. Pilot the directory of services. Once tested and finalized, you will need to pilot the directory of services with your target audience. If your target audience includes children, this specifically requires ensuring children's participation and contribution in the review and validation using child-friendly techniques. Piloting the directory of services will involve determining if the information is understood by the target audience, if members of the target audience understand how to use it, and if there are any ethical considerations that should be addressed. Pilot testing can be done by interviewing or focus group discussions with trafficking victims. You may also request service providers to pilot the directory of services with their victim beneficiaries and then provide feedback. Based on the pilot test, it may be necessary to make adjustments and improvements. If substantial revision is needed, you may need to pilot test the directory of services again. Step 4. Implement the directory of services. At this step, you should develop a strategy to distribute the directory of services, monitor and evaluate use of the directory of services, and revise and update the directory of services. Develop and implement a strategy to distribute the directory of services. The directory of services should be distributed to as many members of the target audience as possible. How this is achieved will be determined by your geographic scope, the format of the directory of services, and available resources. To develop a distribution strategy, consider different locations where you may reach your target audience, as well as organizations or institutions that may be involved. This may include reaching trafficking victims while trafficked, for example, with emergency responders, in health clinics, or through helplines. After exit or escape, for example, in embassies abroad or with service providers in destination countries or communities. During return, for example, with immigration and border authorities or with organizations that support migrant workers. During identification or referral, for example, in police stations or social work centers, or with practitioners responsible for identifying trafficking victims. Once home, for example, in local administrative offices and health clinics, with social workers, child protection agencies, or in community centers. Consider different dissemination strategies that use different platforms to raise awareness of the directory of services. For example, print media, radio and television programs, social media and technology platforms, websites of partner or implementing organizations or institutions, launch events or other formal government meetings, conferences and service provider trainings or meetings. Monitor and evaluate use of the directory of services. It is important to monitor the implementation and use of the directory of services to determine how effective it is in aiding trafficking victims to access assistance. This requires feedback from the target audience on the content in terms of utility, clarity, accessibility, and suitability. Consider also engaging with service providers to document referrals that have come to them as a result of the directory of services. Monitoring also involves assessing if any ethical or legal issues have arisen so that victims can be protected from harm and improvements can be made to the directory of services. Revise and update the directory of services. Information in the directory of services may become quickly out of date. A directory of services should be revised and updated on a regular basis. Determine how often the directory of services will be reviewed and revised in line with available time and resources. The revision process is also an opportunity to improve the directory of services. You should assess what is working well in the directory of services and where improvements may be needed. Consider if adjustments may be needed, for example, regarding the target audience, geographic scope, implementing partners, and so on. This video has provided step-by-step guidance on how to develop and implement a directory of services for trafficking victims, a critical resource that allows trafficking victims to seek out the assistance that they need to support their recovery and reintegration after trafficking. This video is to be used alongside the tool for practitioners on developing a directory of services for trafficking victims. This video was prepared by the Nexus Institute in the framework of the project Improving the Identification, Protection, and Reintegration of Trafficking Victims in Asia, implemented jointly by the Nexus Institute and the Regional Support Office of the Bali Process. The project is generously funded by the Australian Department of Home Affairs through the Bali Process RSO.